The scripture reading comes from Matthew chapter 5, verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. May God bless the reading of his word. Amen. Please be seated. So this morning we conclude our verse-by-verse exposition of the Beatitudes of Matthew 5, 3 through 12. This week we consider Jesus' final promise, which I just read, that those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake are blessed, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, having previously considered the reward of kingdom possession, we will focus our attention upon the nature of this blessed persecution, as well as its object, which is righteousness. We begin with the former. As we witness what purports to be the quickening death of Western civilization, the experience can stir in us an urge to hasten the approaching demise through provocation. The thinking being that if our society is going to return to barbarism anyway, why not just go ahead and precipitate the collapse so that future generations may be spared that debacle? As Thomas Paine famously said, "I prefer peace, but if trouble must come, let it come in my day, so that my children can live in peace." Such magnanimity resonates deeply in the Christian spirit. However, it has to be accompanied by a sober understanding of how that peace will be won. For as Jesus said, "I have come not to bring peace, but a sword," which is to say a peace that is the result of a painful severing, not only of nation from nation and state from state, but brother from brother, and even parent from child. In other words, as Peter Leithart notes, Jesus is not talking here about those awkward moments at family reunions when believers have to answer mocking questions from an atheistic cousin. He's talking here about family members turning believing family members over to the Sanhedrin, over to the courts, or maybe a more contemporary example would be over to the Gestapo. A dormant possibility which we were all awakened to during the COVID lockdowns. That families can either serve as a natural or even supernatural immunity against the deadly virus of tyranny, acting as a last hope for a society. Or a family can serve as the most effective mechanism for communicating that disease. Which is why much of what Jesus has to say about families is in the form of striking admonitions. That if you're going to be his disciple, you must be willing to hate your father and mother, your brother and sister, even your own child. Because when persecution comes, no institution, no earthly bond, not even that between mother and child, is entirely safe from its alienating effects. And so while it is certainly true that we should rejoice when such persecution comes, for the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church, as it goes, it is also true that the harvesting process is a harrowing one, and that historically speaking, only a few have been willing to carry through with it, to put their hand to the plow and not look back. I mean, the fact that all of the disciples, every one of them, abandoned Jesus when he was arrested should extinguish the eagerness of even the most zealous among us. And yet, having said all of that, there are times when societal transformation can only come through the church experiencing that kind of tribulation, as was the case in the first century, when intense persecution from the Jewish leaders was the catalyst for pushing the gospel outside of Jerusalem. The point is that if we don't want to squander the persecution which may soon be upon us, and which is likely necessary due to the church's complacency and complicity, if we don't want to waste that blessing, if we want it to reap its full reward, allowing it to accomplish its good work of not only making us perfect and complete, lacking in nothing, but also provoking us into the kind of bold ministry necessary to renew our culture. If we want the persecution to be the kind of persecution that we can rejoice in, then we must prepare ourselves for it. And such preparation requires that we give close attention to the qualifying preposition in our text, for righteousness' sake. If persecution is going to bring blessing, its object must be righteousness, which is to say that there is a way to suffer under persecution which is not righteous, which squanders all of its benefits. Indeed, the implicit woe from Jesus in our text, which is to say the blessing stated in negative form, is not just woe to you when all people speak well of you, for so their fathers did of the false prophets, which is what we find in the parallel Luke passage. It's not just, in other words, woe to you who are not suffering persecution, but even woe to you who suffer it wrongly, for you suffer in vain. And the potential for such vain suffering means that we are in desperate need of divine guidance for navigating this perilous path that we are now on, this Via Dolorosa. And one of the biblical texts which proffers such wisdom is the Epistle of James, a text which we have been referencing time and again throughout this series, for it is deeply influenced by the teachings of Jesus and the Beatitudes. Indeed, it is in some ways an extension of that teaching, for it is, I think, an application of our text this morning, Matthew 5:10. Now, many have thought of James as a kind of Proverbs for the New Testament, as a general epistle containing collected bits of wisdom for the early church. But I'm in full agreement with biblical scholar Jeffrey Myers, who argues that this letter is actually wisdom literature for Christian dissidents, meaning that it's a text written for people like us, whose culture is becoming increasingly hostile toward them and toward the gospel. And thus, in part, this letter's purpose is to instruct embattled Christians on how to suffer righteously, on how to get the most benefit from the persecution that they face, on how to use that persecution as a catalyst for cultural renewal, and not for bringing further disorder into the cosmos. Now, to see this truth requires some understanding of the historical setting of the epistle, which I plan to lay out with the remainder of our time. My goal is to make the case this morning for the applicability of James to our present context, with the hope of returning to the epistle at a later date in order to then mine it for all of its practical wisdom. Now, much of what I'm going to say here is a summary of Jeffrey Myers' commentary on James, which I highly recommend, although that's not to say that I agree with everything in it. It has quite a few provocative things within it, ideas within it. But its greatest contribution, I think, is that it helps the reader to see this epistle through fresh eyes. And it does so in an accessible way. Now, Myers gives a very early date to James, and this really is key. He sees the epistle as one of the earliest Christian texts, being written only a few years after Pentecost, or after the dramatic events that we read about in Acts chapter 2, where we have the inauguration of the church age, as we might call it, through the pouring out of the Spirit. And thus this epistle is written to an infant church which has been born into a hostile environment, a child who has been essentially rejected by its mother, the nation of Israel, and who has drawn the ire of the ruler of the world, Satan. Now, James refers to his audience as the 12 tribes of the dispersion, a description which is loaded with meaning. For example, the Greek word diaspora, which is the word under the English word dispersion, is used in the New Testament as essentially a technical term for Jewish Christians who have been driven out of Jerusalem following the stoning of Stephen. And the reference to the 12 tribes is, of course, Jewish as well, although here it speaks to those who are both physical and spiritual descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Meaning that these exiles are Israelites indeed, as Jesus would call them, members of the true circumcision who have wrongly been banished from their holy city. Now, James also refers to these dispersed Christians as a kind of first fruits in chapter 1, verse 18, which is another technical word that's used in Scripture to refer to the first converts in a particular region. And as such, as first fruits, part of the use of the metaphor there is, this idea of being the first fruits of a coming harvest. It's to give the sense that their actions are going to have a significant influence upon what's going to come later, upon the advancement of Christ's church. Their behavior in the present, in other words, will reverberate through church history. And so there is a great need for them to get things right from the start, and thus the necessity of an apostle writing this kind of letter to them. We might also think of their lives as an offering to God as the first fruits, right? The first of the seasonal crop, which is sacrificed for the sake of the rest of the harvest. And at times I wonder if we also are the first fruits of a new harvest. I wonder if anybody else feels that way, because we are certainly going through a transition in our culture from what some have called a neutral world in terms of the way society views Christianity, very much to a negative one, a negative view of our religion. At least that's how Aaron Wren has framed this transition from neutral world to negative world. And thus, what we do now, right, the sacrifices we are willing to make as Christians and as a church now, or not make, will dramatically affect, I think, the progress of God's kingdom in the next 10 or 20 or 50 or even 100 years. Which again makes reading James a matter of first importance to us. In many ways, I think this epistle was written to us, to people just like us. Now, there's no question that these scattered Christians face severe persecution. The numerous references to trials and sufferings in the letter establish that fact. For example, after the briefest of salutations, the letter begins this way: "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." The sufferings of these Christians is obviously at the forefront of James' mind. And we get a sense of who these persecutors are starting in chapter 2. In James 2, verses 6 and 7, it says, "Are not the rich the ones who oppress you, and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called?" Now here's what's interesting. The rich here, according to Myers, are not simply the wealthy among them, as it has often been thought. Because later they are described as visiting the synagogues where these Christians are worshiping, and they do so wearing robes, we are told, and rings, which signify their authority. That's in chapter 2, verse 2. They are what Myers calls the theocratically rich, for they possess, we are told in chapter 5, the gold and silver and the treasures of the temple, and live gloriously in the promised land. In other words, James is referring here to the Jewish leaders from Jerusalem who have rejected Jesus and his authority and who exercise control over all of the synagogues. They are the ones who send out men like Saul of Tarsus to round up and persecute members of the Way, as they were called early on. And the severity of their efforts is also revealed in chapter 5, when James takes to rebuking these leaders directly. This is James' woe section to his epistle. In James 5:4, he says, "Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." This is metaphorical language that James uses throughout his epistle, this idea of harvesters, those who are harvesting righteousness, those who are fulfilling the cultural mandate, who are shaping and changing a culture through the converting of individual souls and entire societies. Those are the ones who the leaders in Jerusalem are holding back their wages, right, by fraud. They are trying to prevent them from accomplishing their task. In verse 6 of chapter 5, he says, "You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you." Now, it might be helpful to take a moment to reflect upon the social imaginary of these embattled believers. That is to say, to set them in their socio-religious context. Many of them, no doubt, were committed Israelites, as we might say, meaning that they grew up not only hearing the hallowed tales of Israel's history, but regularly reenacting them in public worship. And as a community under Roman oppression, they longed for redemption. They longed for the Messiah, for their king to return and to vindicate them before the nations of the earth, to come and to set up his political kingdom. Believing, no doubt, that surely his time must soon come. For how much longer would God delay in rescuing his people from their exile? And no doubt some of them had heard about or perhaps even witnessed John's preaching about the kingdom of God being at hand, and then hearing the rumors of miracles and wonders performed by a man named Jesus of Nazareth. But it was likely the events of Pentecost which led them to their conversion. The pouring out of the Spirit with all of its confirmatory signs, pointing back to all these prophetic texts in the Old Testament with the rushing wind and the ecstatic speech and the tongues of fire, etc. Having no way of knowing that their pilgrimage to the temple that day would end with the Spirit dwelling in them, right? That they would become the temple of God when they surrendered to the Spirit. And this regenerative indwelling would have been followed by a time of peace and fellowship among a growing brotherhood, sitting at the apostles' feet and standing in awe of their attesting miracles, rejoicing in the news that their king had been victorious over the principalities and powers of this world, and that through his Spirit he had begun to free the captives and to reclaim his lands, and that soon his kingdom's borders would reach the four corners of the earth, as is promised in Zechariah 8:7. And for these Israelites, the resurrection of Jesus and the pouring out of the Spirit marked not only the return of God's kingdom, but of their true vocation as ruling priests within it. The privilege of participating in the reclaiming and renewing of the cosmos. God would transform the world through them. All of which is to say that their expectations could not have been higher. Yet, in the days that followed, things didn't go the way they expected them to. After the initial period of growth and popularity, an opposition began to form among the leaders of the nation. Attempts to intimidate and silence the apostles by arresting and flogging them, all of which crescendoed in the stoning of Stephen, which launched a citywide persecution. This growing threat scattered these young disciples across Judea and even as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, it says in Acts 11:19, compelling many of them to leave their families and to leave their homes, to leave their synagogues, the places where they went to worship, to leave their livelihoods, to leave their culture, to leave the temple. A painful separation which caused, no doubt, confusion and frustration. It caused anger and impatience, perhaps even resentment, as they were scattered about and forced to huddle together in small communities throughout the Roman world. And as if that weren't bad enough, they were soon pursued by these Jewish leaders, who sent zealots like Saul of Tarsus to arrest them and drag them back to Jerusalem to face prosecution. Listen to how Paul describes his previous profession as the apostle of the high priest in Acts 22, 4 and 5. I persecuted this way to the death. This way is Christianity. Binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear me witness. From them I received letters to the brothers, and I journeyed toward Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. These are the refugees that James is writing to encourage and instruct, to reset their expectations and to focus them upon the task at hand. For they were ready to be the instruments through whom God would establish his rule on earth as it is in heaven. They were ready to be the Lord's husbandmen, planting and harvesting his righteousness, his justice in the world, as James speaks about it in chapter 3. And yet this project didn't seem to be going very well at all from their point of view. For the God of this world appeared to have gained the upper hand. Indeed, God's bid to reclaim the earth seemed to be a complete bust. A similarly disorienting experience, I think, to those who met in the upper room following the crucifixion of Jesus. They could not comprehend how it is that Jesus could be the Messiah if God had just cursed him by hanging on a tree. That was some serious cognitive dissonance. And the disciples of the diaspora, of the dispersion, were similarly confused and were in need of a fresh revelation of the Spirit so that they might be empowered with both wisdom and boldness as the first disciples were in that upper room. Now, it's important to note that James is not writing to these Christians to regrettably inform them that they have made a terrible mistake, having misunderstood the apostolic message entirely. The correction which constitutes this letter is not that these young believers had gotten the gospel exactly backwards. James is not saying that our actual commission is not to bring heaven to earth, but to bring a remnant on earth to heaven. That the good news is about escape from this soon-to-be annihilated planet, not the redemption of the planet. And thus, why you're facing so many difficulties is because, you thought the exact opposite of what's supposed to happen is going to happen. On the contrary, James affirms that they are to be reaping the righteousness of God in this world. Indeed, it is the subtext of the entire letter. His correction is to focus upon making sure that these laborers go about that harvesting in the right way. For a harvest of righteousness, he says, is sown in peace by those who make peace. Meaning that the goal is to make peace, as we've said previously, a peace which can only come through the return of justice, as we demonstrated. But that such peacemaking, such harvesting of righteousness in a desolate world requires time and patience and maturity. Like the wise farmer, James says to these brethren, they must wait for the precious fruit of the earth to receive both the early and the late rains. For we are talking about real transformation that needs to happen. A change in substance, not mere appearance. Metanoia is the Greek word, a real change of the soul, a change of the heart, a receiving of the implanted word which can only take root when nourished by the tears of godly grief. A full acknowledgement of one's poverty of spirit. For only the humble will be exalted, says James, while the exalted will be humbled. Facing such violent resistance also requires a pure heart, he tells us. The putting away of double-mindedness, as James calls it, and dedicating oneself solely to Christ and his mission. If you are not able to do that, then you will not survive this kind of persecution. It also requires wise meekness, according to the apostle. Those are his words. Which is not, as we discussed, weakness, but strength which is in complete submission to God. which waits on his command, which is not impotent, but is potent and powerful, but is under submission. And this really is a warning against the temptation to vigilantism, which is a major theme in this epistle. The deceitful desire, born in frustration to take vengeance into one's own hands, to motivate one's efforts by anger, forgetting that the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God, as James says in chapter 1, verse 20. And thus the great need, James will speak about, to control the tongue. That's central to this epistle. When we get to the study of it, we'll look at this chiastic structure that we've discussed in the past. Right at the center of the chiasm of that structure is the idea of the teachers of this group, the leaders of this group, controlling their tongue. Because the tongue is able to burn down entire forests instead of cultivating them. And neither will showing partiality to one's oppressors accomplish God's goals, says James, giving them the chief seats in the synagogues in the hopes of gaining favor. For God's laborers must hunger and thirst for righteousness more than they do for maintaining order, or for protecting their good reputation, or even for ensuring their safety. And the Lord's laborers must also learn how to mourn if they are to make this persecution productive, and also how to show mercy, to balance mercy and justice, and on we can go. Which is to say that harvesting righteousness requires the very things that we've been discussing in our study of the Beatitudes: humility, meekness, a hunger for righteousness, mercy, purity of heart, etc. Hopefully we're starting to see how these two texts relate to one another. James being a particular application of the general truth that's taught in Matthew 5:10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. What does that mean, to be persecuted for righteousness' sake? For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So James is giving instruction, as we said, to Christian dissidents, people just like us, whose culture is becoming increasingly hostile toward them and the gospel, which makes this letter compellingly prescient for us today, and why we will begin soon a study of it.